While we're waiting to get started, we'd like to invite you to put your country into the chat so we can see where everybody's from. I'll put mine in. Oh, we have some of our Australian colleagues today. Great. Slovenia, Japan. From London. And UK, Kazakhstan. From Korea. Somebody else from Japan. From China. Portugal. Dominic from Argentina. Welcome, Dominic. All right, so maybe we should get started now. So welcome everyone. I'm Kathleen Shearer, the Executive Director of COAR, which is the Confederation of Open Access Repositories. And I'm pleased that you're here to attend our webinar about science, technology, and policy innovation development in India, which is being organized jointly by COAR and CIIPC. And this is part of our activities around promoting bibliodiversity and highlighting national policies that we hope will advance open access and also bibliodiversity. So before I introduce our speaker, just a couple of housekeeping things. We welcome you again to put the country that you're from in the chat. Please mute your microphones while Arul is speaking. And we will be recording the session. So just to let you know, there's a lot of people who are unable to attend due to time zones or other commitments. So we'll be recording the session and making it available afterwards. And also we will take questions at the end of the presentation or comments. So you can either put in your question in the chat, or you can put up your hand and just you can unmute your microphone and ask your question. Okay, so without further ado, it's a great pleasure today to introduce you to our speaker, Dr. Arul George Scaria, who's an associate professor of law and co-director of the Center of Innovation, Intellectual Property and Competition at National Law University in Delhi. He's a very active and engaged in a number of activities that you can read about on his CV that's linked from the website. He has a very impressive resume. But today he's going to talk about policy development process in India. He is the co-chair of a thematic group constituted by the principal scientific advisor to the Prime Minister and the Department of Science and Technology of India for drafting the Science, Technology and Innovation Policy 2020. So with that, I'd like to turn the floor over to Arul and say thank you very much again for agreeing to present to us today.
Hello everyone. First of all, I would like to thank Kathleen and Irina for inviting me for this discussion. It's indeed a pleasure and privilege to be part of this particular discussion series. And thanks to all of you who have joined from different parts of the world for this particular webinar. And I really hope to learn from all of you through the discussions which we will be having after my initial remarks. So if I understand correctly, I'm having around 20 minutes for my initial remarks. But of course, I think the general format which has been followed in this particular platform is that we'll be asking questions after the initial remarks. But In view of the fact that I generally prefer a dialogue, please also feel free to interrupt me anytime during the presentation. I know I haven't taken permission from Kathleen on this aspect, but I think I might also be presenting some data from India, so it's also possible that you might have certain specific questions relating to the data which I present. So if there are questions, I feel maybe you should feel free to interrupt and then ask those questions. So yeah, with that, maybe I should move to the initial remarks. So as you can see from the title, I'm not going to talk about open access policies in India today, but open access policy development process in India. And I guess Kathleen and Irina was picking up the topic carefully in this regard, because as she also mentioned during the introduction, I was part of the drafting process of this Science, Technology and Innovation Policy 2020. By the way, this particular policy is not yet out, even though it's saying 2020. Yes, we are also expecting it to come out in the next 2 or 3 weeks, and it was happening in multiple stages. And I was part of one of the tracks of this particular drafting process. So as you can see from the screen, the government of India had adopted a 4-track system for evolving this particular policy document, which I would say is still in the process of making. And I was part of track 2, which comprised of 21 thematic groups which focused on different aspects. And the thematic group 1, of which I was part of, was focusing on the issue of access to knowledge and resources. So the initial part of my presentation today will be focusing on the kind of deliberations which we had within this particular thematic group. But I must also add here very specifically that yes, once we put forward our recommendations, it also went through multiple rounds of revisions, additions, deletions, etc. And I must confess that I am also not completely aware of the current position the government has taken on many of the issues which I will be presenting. So all what I can present with confidence is what we recommended and what we deliberated within the thematic group. So that's something which you need to keep in mind. And if you want to see the final set of recommendations that are approved by the government, maybe we'll have to wait for like 1 or 2 more weeks. So at least from the interviews which I saw yesterday, it appears like the government is still saying yes, they want to release the first draft within the next 2 to 3 weeks. Okay, so if I look at the major recommendations from our thematic group, the place where I think we could see almost complete unanimity within the committee members was India needs a strong green open access policy, wherein final versions of all accepted manuscripts from researchers from public funded institutions or those arising from publicly funded research must be deposited along with supplementary materials to a national repository or to an institutional repository. So on this aspect, there was almost complete agreement within the group. There was also agreement within the group on the need for setting up a good national level research repository which can archive science and technology research outputs from all kinds of public funded research. And we were very specific in recommending that this should include manuscripts, data, supplementary information, software, and research protocols. So on both these aspects, there was, I would say, complete unanimity among the group members. But the major area of debate and disagreement was on the question of whether we should allow the payment of article processing charges from public funds. So if you look at the model which was suggested by the chair of the group, it reads something like this, wherein you can notice that APC payments by others via grants is discouraged but will be permitted for reputable journals when there is no option. Then the statement also says that the government may negotiate with reputable open access publishers who charge APC to remove the burden of APC from the researchers to the government or move to a subscription-like mechanism so that the researchers can submit to such journals without being concerned about the article processing charges. The statement also specifically mentions that predatory publishers must be strictly excluded from the ambit of this particular payment mechanism. And then, yes, it was also advocating for a centralized payment system for APCs, for all reputable APC-based journals, and payment of APCs directly by authors via grants should be discontinued. So this was the crux of the APC-related recommendation, which was proposed by the chair of the group. As I mentioned earlier, yes, this was also discussed and debated at length within the group, and there were serious disagreements. So let's also look at the kind of arguments that came from both the sides. So with respect to the arguments that were made in support of article payment charges, article processing charges payment, there was a note which was prepared by the chair of the group, that was Professor Arul. So I'm going to share with you the major arguments shared in that particular note. So the major argument which they raised was the APC-based open access model has become widely adopted in different fields like biomedical sciences, and to some extent in fields like chemistry, physics, and others. And if they have become widely adopted, at least according to the section which supported this payment model, they said that we should recognize that fact and then we should allow the payment of article processing charges. So that was a main argument which was put forward in the note which was prepared by Professor Arul. And then they also mentioned that yes, green open access, if it becomes successful eventually, will lead to the death of the subscription journal model, which is not a bad thing. But then we also need to evolve alternative research venues and models. And they pointed out that journals are adding more and more restrictions and embargoes to hamper the green open access option. So as we can also see, different publishers like Elsevier have actually gone forward and put more embargoes very specifically with respect to preprints. And this group, which was in support of APC payments, mentioned that, okay, this is not a great thing to happen, or this is not a great improvement over what we are having today, that is closed access. They also mentioned that, yes, the green open access model might be answering certain accessibility related issues, but leaves a lot of issues unresolved, and this includes discoverability, then the usability of the material, because in many cases, yes, people are sharing it without specifically telling what all rights are granted to the users of those preprints. And in many instances, there is also clear lack of identification of the version made available. Then they also pointed out that prestige and authority are still a fact that remains in our society. So even when a particular preprint is corresponding to a published article, that symbolic capital is remaining tied to the present journal system. So these are also set of additional arguments which they made. Then on the cost front also, they made certain arguments, primary being, if you are comparing it with our existing subscription system, the amount of money which the exchequer will be paying for APC-based gold open access publications will be lower. Based on some compilation of data, they also made the argument that even though the individual APCs might look high, if you look at the actual amount that has been spent by India on APCs, it is far smaller as compared to the amount which we are paying for subscription. Again, I re-emphasize, the comparison is being made with respect to what we are paying for subscription, not with respect to the question of whether we are paying APCs for all open access channels. They also finally made the argument that publishers like PLOS or eLife Sciences are undertaking several progress initiatives Some of these include open peer review, and others like the mandatory data sharing, which is required. Yes, when people are taking these kinds of important progressive initiatives, maybe we should also support those kinds of journals, even if they are charging article processing charges. Then they also made the argument that yes, these kinds of journals have also made works accessible to the general public around the world, and we cannot ignore that issue of accessibility. Last but not the least, they also made the argument that we cannot easily assume that these publishers will refrain from legal action against preprint or postprint archives, and they also cited certain examples in this regard, which I'm sure many of you might be aware of. So these are the major arguments that I could see within the group in support of having a system for paying article processing charges from public funds. But there was also an equally strong group within the committee who were against payment of article processing charges, and this includes me and my colleague Madan Muthu. So we prepared a dissenting note on this particular statement, which was drafted by the chair, and you can also access it from the link which I have mentioned on the screen, and I would only be happy to share the presentation later, so you can also access it directly there. And we try to point out certain things which India should take into consideration before agreeing for a proposal like this. The most important being article processing charges are exclusionary and elitist in character. So if you look at the APC-based Gold Open Access journals, yes, they might be addressing the issue of accessibility, but then they are completely ignoring the issue of affordability. And they are also completely ignoring the question of whether what we are doing is an equitable act. And if you look at the way generally APCs are working within the country today, you will notice that the payment for APCs are taken by, or I mean, that payment is done only in favor of certain elitist institutions and only a small section of researchers. So this is going to further aggravate the inequality in research within the country as well as at the global level. So that's something which we should not be supporting. Then we also mentioned categorically that if you are going to allow APCs based on the fact that this is a common practice in some disciplines, then what we are going to do in effect is we are going to incentivize more disciplines to adopt the APC-based publishing model. And that's not a desirable result. So here also one of the important things which we should know is that, so my colleague Madan Muthu was also looking at the 2019 data on open access articles published from India. And we could notice that only in around 20% of such cases, article processing charges had to be paid. And do we want to make policies that are catering only to that 20%? That's something which we need to ask. And yes, as we all know, not all open access journals charge APCs, and we try to re-emphasize that point also. And we also pointed out that India is not going to get any additional benefit from the APC-based models because we are already proposing a green open access model as part of this particular policy. As some of the scholars have cited or discussed earlier, it is also ethically suspicious to make payment for publishing your research. And as we all know, it is these APC-based models that have given rise to predatory publications across the world. And if you look at the data in this regard, yes, you will also notice that the numbers are shoot up like anything. So I think from 4,000 in maybe 2015 or 16 to maybe more than 20,000 predatory journals over the recent years. And if you are going to do, or if you are going to support APC-based models now, it is also going to jeopardize the existing science communication process. Because if you have to make a payment model for APC, yes, then we have to also make it based on certain calculations, and as everyone can understand, publishers don't have any incentives in providing transparent costing or pricing there. And if you are going to make policies based on false assumptions, it's gonna jeopardize the existing order and system completely. We also try to point out that there is growing resistance from within the scientific community with respect to article processing charges. And when we are making a policy in 2020, we should not ignore that growing resistance. We also try to break the myth of this lower APC. So as at least some of you might be aware of, at least at one point, people were making the argument that the article processing charges will go down over the years. So some people even said, yes, publishers like PLOS are going to charge zero in the future. But if you look at what has happened in reality, they have only gone up rather than going down. And we all know what nature is demanding now, right? So that myth of lower APCs is also something that had to be reverted, and we have tried our best in this particular regard. When people try to point out that, okay, not all journals will be charging the same APCs for scholars from all parts of the world, we also try to point out that we need to protect the self-respect of researchers. So when a researcher have to ask for a waiver of APC or reduction of APC, they are also sacrificing their self-respect. Do we really want to do that? That's something which we also try to ask. Then when it comes to a country like India, yes, we have only very limited financial resources. So we also need to be very, very careful about where we spend our money. Should we dedicate a substantial part of our resources to payment of APCs? That's also an important question which we as a country need to ask. We also try to point out that when we make a policy in 2020, we should actually look at the question of whether we want to support the existing communication system, which is giving over reliance on things like impact factor, or should we emphasize more on the importance of the contents we publish? And if you are going for APCs, we are going to in effect support the system, the current system, which is more like a prestige tax or prestige extortion. So we need to be very, very careful about that front also. Last but not the least, we also try to point out that if India is going to take a position like this with respect to APC payments, it's also going to set a wrong message for the global south. So any position which we take in support of APCs are going to send a wrong signal across the global south. So these are the major arguments which we made against APCs, and so we prepared a strong dissenting note in this regard. And to be frank, we still do not know what is the final position the government has taken on this particular issue. So as I mentioned at the beginning of this discussion, maybe we'll have to wait for a couple of more days to see what India will be doing in this particular regard. But I thought that since our focus today is on the open access policy development process, it is important that I highlight this important issue before all of you. So in this context, maybe I should also discuss briefly what are the major challenges for the open access movement in India. And in this regard, I must also quickly share some insights from a report which we had prepared. There is an Open Science India report. You can access the report as well as the complete data set from the link which I have provided here. So the link to the data set can also be accessed from there. The context of this discussion, I'm sure most of you are familiar with. So like most other countries in the world, India is also going through a severe crisis in science. The only difference might be that we may not want to acknowledge it very explicitly. And it is also a fact that not much has changed in this regard over the last couple of years. For example, I was reading a 1978 article from my wonderful colleague, Professor Arunachalam, wherein I can see the fundamental question he asked in 1978 was, why is Indian science mediocre? And he had mentioned certain important factors there. And when I was reading it like 2 or 3 days back, I was asking myself, has many things changed? And unfortunately, the answer would be that not many things have changed over the years. So it was in this context that we conducted this particular study. And as at least some of you might be aware of, yes, India is facing severe crisis both in terms of the production of science as well as in terms of the consumption side. Since we are focusing more on that consumption side today, I would also like to share some data here. So if you look at the data from different sources, you will see that papers from Indian researchers are some of the highest fraud and retraction rates. And India publishes the highest number, almost like 27% of predatory journals globally. And the highest percentage of authors contributing to predatory journals are also from India. And there are also many journals which add authors to papers they didn't write, and that's often for a fee. So these are important indicators of the crisis in science. Unfortunately, we often tend to ignore these kinds of indicators. So it was in this context that we conducted this study, and we examined in detail the status of different open access initiatives in India. So if I look at the history of open access initiatives in India, I can notice that even though it's very hard to precisely say, okay, when open access movement started in India, but at least I can say that in the year 2001, the first institutional repository was set up at Indian Institute of Science. But have we achieved substantial progress in terms of sharing through institutional repositories over the years? My answer would be no. So we had evolved a national level open access policy. That is a policy formulated by the Department of Biotechnology and Department of Science and Technology in the year 2014. But our study indicates that we haven't made much progress in spite of the existence of that open access mandate from two of the biggest funders in India. And there are different reasons for that. So one thing is clear lack of awareness about those policies. So we also try to study in detail whether these funding agencies have tried to communicate to the researchers the existence of this particular policy, and also whether they communicated regarding the mandate, like what will happen if you don't comply with the policy. So our study indicates that, sorry, that wasn't really happening. So there was no communication with regard to the existence of the policy, as well as also there was no really good communication with regard to what will happen if they don't comply with the policy. We also examined in detail, and we compared it, the different open access mandates in India with different other open access mandates in other parts of the world, and we could see that in terms of both coverage as well as in terms of the rights granted to the users, many of them lacked clarity. So that's also a major limitation which we could actually notice. And if you look at the most important, the centralized harvester in India today, the Science Central, you will notice that even today, so this is the data from today, you can only see 3,636 deposits in the central harvester. So for a country of India size, for the country of size of India, which has that many researchers, 3,636 deposits is nothing, right? So that's a big indicator of where we are today in terms of open access. So we also try to look at the attitudes and practices of researchers. So let me also show you in 2 or 3 minutes what were the major insights from our data. So we ask questions of how far do you rely on publications which are available openly? Yes, most people said yes, they rely on it. But when it comes to the question of sharing their publications through an open access repository, as you can see here, only a small subset of those people, that is around 37%, shared their publications through an open access repository. So we also tried to look at the sharing practices in detail, and as you can see from the screen, sharing through open access repositories is very limited, and generally people prefer to share when someone was asking them for the particular publication or a copy of the publication. With respect to data, things were even worse. So you can see only around 8.4% of our samples shared the data through open access repository. We also tried to explore what are the benefits they perceived from sharing, and as you can see here, a substantial segment of the that they didn't get any benefit through sharing. So maybe this is also indicating one of the problems or one of the reasons for the crisis. So if we haven't been able to communicate to the biggest stakeholder, that is researcher, why sharing is important, then yes, people may not be incentivized to share through open access repository. So that might be an indicator of one of the reasons. We also try to look at the factors that are discouraging people from open sharing of publications specifically. And interesting, as you can see here, two of the biggest things or factors which they pointed out was they are not willing to pay money to the publishers to publish an article, that is article processing charges, and or they are not able to fund the article processing charges, which also indicates that people are thinking, or a substantial segment of researchers are thinking, that all gold open access journals are those which charge article processing charges. Again, that's a myth that needs to be broken, but a lot more work needs to be done in this particular regard. We also asked them whether they are satisfied with the existing rules with regard to sharing of publications. And unfortunately, as you can see here, like 54% or 55% either said they are satisfied or extremely satisfied with the current rules on open access to publication. Finally, we also asked them whether they have made any attempts to change the institutional rules or practices with regard to how research is conducted or how research is disseminated. In both the cases, yes, the substantial portion of the respondents said no, but the worst group was like 21 or more than 21% never felt the need to do that. And I think that's the biggest crisis in the open access policy development process in India. So if you ask me what is the biggest issue or what is the biggest challenge for the open access movement in India today, the challenge is that most of the researchers are still not convinced on the need for open access in India. And the existing open access policies have failed terribly in communicating, one, the existence of policy, second, what will happen if they don't comply with policy. So a lot more need to be done with respect to open access in India. And I truly hope that the final document, which we will see through the Science, Technology and Innovation Policy 2020 in India, will be something that will reinforce the three basic principles of the Budapest Open Access Initiative, that is the principles of accessibility, affordability, and equity. The discussions which we had as part of the thematic group says that it's quite challenging to ensure that all the three principles will be met, but I'm truly hoping that eventually that will be the result. So with that, I will end my initial remarks, and I really look forward to hearing from you. I know that I had to rush through the data, but if there is any questions specific to the data or any of the other aspects which I mentioned, I would be only happy to explain them in detail. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Arul. That was really interesting, and I think a lot of the themes that you touched on resonate with many of us from other countries as well. I didn't catch the third thing you said: accessibility, the three principles: affordability, accessibility,
and equity.
And equity. Okay.
Yeah.
I really like the way you put that. So now I would invite anybody who has questions either to put your hand up, and you can just unmute your microphone if I call on you, or you're welcome to put questions or comments into the chat as well. And maybe while people are thinking about that, I can start by asking a question myself. You know, this whole issue, you mentioned that in India there's a higher prevalence, or a fairly high prevalence of fraud or publishing in predatory journals.
Absolutely.
And I wondered you know, why do you think that's happening in India more than in other places? Is it because there's a lot of pressure to publish by research assessment systems, or what's your opinion?
So the biggest challenge, there is a current research assessment system. So if you look at the way researchers are assessed for their career progress in India, so there is something called Academic Performance Index. And the primary focus of the Academic Performance Index, which most of the universities and research institutions are doing, is the number of publications. So they don't look at the question of what you publish, but they just look at the question of number of publications. And if you are focusing only on number, the incentive for researchers is to just write anything which they want and publish in the place where they can publish it with the the best possible speed, right? So if we have a perverse incentive mechanism like that, it's quite obvious that it will lead to proliferation of predatory journals. So that's the biggest challenge India is facing at the moment. And so far, I haven't seen a step coming from the side of the government to address this issue. So of course, there was one creation of a white list, but then again, if I look at the white list also, you will see that many of them are predatory journals. So that's the biggest challenge which we are having.
Yeah. So do you think that they will address that in the policy that's going to be coming out in the next couple of weeks? Will the policy be addressing that issue in terms of maybe saying it's not how many articles you publish, but what the quality of the article is?
So as part of our thematic group, we discussed this issue in detail, and we took a very, very strong position that yes, what is published is that should be the focus rather than the number of publications. But again, as I mentioned earlier, so this particular drafting process is happening through like 4 parallel tracks, and we were just one of them actually. So I do not know what happened after we submitted our recommendation. So it's very much probable that things might have been taken out later, or maybe more things were added. But I truly hope that the final document which we will see in the coming days will address this particular issue. Because if we don't address that issue, again, we are going to see the repeat of the same problems which we have been facing over the last many years. So that we have to address the issue of completely revamping the assessment system. That has to actually happen.
Yeah, it's fundamental.
I must also add here one more thing. So some of the institutions are also these days focusing heavily on where you publish. Again, I mean, that's gonna only increase the problem of this extortion that is happening in the name of reputable journals. Again, I mean, when we are drafting a policy in 2020, and if we are one of the countries in the global south, I think it's an opportunity to make a statement that we are not in support of this. So I'm truly hoping that CIIP 2020 will also take a strong position on that front, saying that, okay, what we are going to consider is not the impact factor of the journal also. So that's also something which we will have to really hope for in the new document.
Yeah, it's going to be really interesting to see. So we have Irina who has her hand up. Irina, do you have a question?
Thanks a lot, Arul, for your talk, and thank you very much for being tireless open access and access to knowledge advocate, and for being so active in the sphere. As you know, we all keep a close eye on your policy developments because that would be, I think, a game changer for many countries. And you mentioned a number of concerns, and these are also concerns that we are facing when we work with institutions and countries on open access policy developments. Because I guess when we all started with open access, we welcomed as much open access as possible, and we didn't really focus too much on how that open access is achieved. And I think now it's really a high time to be careful about details of open access implementation, and what you mentioned is equity and affordability are important topics. And another challenge you mentioned, that the current policy is National Science, Technology and Innovation Policy. And if we want to change research assessment, we should go to another type of policy where research assessment is addressed. So I don't know if you have any recipes how this first two different decision-making bodies that make policies could work together to make sure that those policies are aligned. What we want for open science and innovation in a country is aligned with what Ministry of Education wants for universities. And then what would be, my second question is, what would be your ideal open science policy now that could be, I don't know, implemented in India and also in other countries, and other countries, I mean, again, from IFL's perspective, other countries in Asia or Africa or Europe.
Thanks, Irina, for asking this question. So maybe I should also clarify one additional aspect. So the science, technology, and innovation policy is not an open access policy, so it's a much more comprehensive one. So I really hope that when they're making that final draft, they look at the overall scenario, which also includes the research assessment mechanism in India. But you interestingly pointed out, yes, Ministry of Education also, and then I was just asking myself, was the Ministry of Education a part of this particular exercise? And if I recall correctly, no. I think that's going to be an interesting thing to watch for. So I do not know whether it happened in one of the other tracks. So it's also possible that maybe one of the tracks might have addressed it. So maybe they might have invited people from the other ministry. But if they are not consulting people from Ministry of Education, yes, there's certainly going to be a big disaster. But let's be hopeful here. So I'm truly hoping that they consulted people from the Ministry of Education also. So there are also some people who say that maybe yes, there is this comprehensive science, technology, and innovation policy that is happening now, but maybe we should have another separate open access or an open science policy. But to be frank, I'm not much in favor of having too many different policies which are never enforced, but maybe we should have one policy wherein I think we are addressing these issues as comprehensively as possible, because these are all part of that broader picture of the science, technology, and innovation framework in a country, and I don't think we can treat these issues in isolation. And as I mentioned earlier, some of the scholars like Richard Pointer have pointed out repeatedly, and in this regard, I would also recommend all of you to read his latest ebook, which was released on December 2nd. We have to go back to that Budapest initiative and ask ourselves, what did we achieve in the last so many years? And as he rightly points out, yes, maybe the issue of accessibility has been addressed to some extent, at least in some parts of the world. But on the other two fronts, affordability and equity, we have failed miserably. And it is high time for addressing that particular issue. And if we are framing an open science policy today, yes, we have to look at all these three elements and then frame our policy, which includes even measures that should be taken for offline communication of science. So in a country like India, yes, we can talk about open science, which is generally discussed in the context of online media, but maybe for countries in the global south, we should even think about offline communication. What are the different steps which we can actually take to ensure that science is communicated to people without access to internet? And again, I mean, when you were asking about how an open science policy should look like, yes, it should also make sure that the priority is on the content of science rather than on where we publish or how we publish science. So I think that should be the primary focus of an open science policy, which is being framed today.
Thank you. Yeah, I completely agree with you. And I don't quite understand why it's hard for, communities of researchers to judge whether their colleagues are publishing something of quality or not.
Exactly. Because there are many universities across the world wherein, say, for example, the tenure process is done entirely in the manner which you suggested, right? So the peers will come together, evaluate what kind of research she produced, and then, yes, confer tenureship. Similarly, yes, I think we can actually extend it to a broader level and we can definitely achieve it. But the only thing is that we are, I think, too comfortable with what we are having today. And that's also the reason why I was showing you that particular slide, wherein you can see the inertia of the Indian researchers. So we think yeah, there is no need to change the current status quo. I think is the biggest challenge which we as a community is facing today in.
So we have another couple of questions in the chat. One is from Gusun Gunis from Istanbul, Turkey, and he says, India is a very important country, especially in the field of publishing. What are the change rates for electronic publishing, especially APC fees? And I guess he's talking about journals in India and whether they're charging APCs and what's the current status?
That's an interesting question. So again, if I look at the kind of spam emails which I and many of my colleagues receive in this regard, it's often a kind of a bargain which happens. So generally, they will be sending a request saying, okay, are you interested in publishing? We can publish your article tomorrow. And then, yes, when you actually contact this particular publisher, yes, then they will actually kind of assess how much you can pay and then suggest the article processing charge. And many a times it's also depending on the question of when is your evaluation due. So if you have an evaluation which is happening next month or something of like that, yes, they're definitely going to charge you a bomb for publishing your article. But if they also kind of understand that, okay, you are also not in an emergency situation, then yes, they will reduce the charge. So I cannot really say an average amount there. It varies substantially, and it's really a really interesting kind of bargaining that happens there. And in the vast majority of communications I have seen in this particular regard, they don't mention the APC charges explicitly, so they will communicate to you only when you get in touch with them. So it's a private communication that happens there. And I think that's also happening for a reason now, because as I mentioned earlier, India is currently having a white list, so they call it as a CARE list. So the University Grants Commission has something called a CARE list, wherein they have mentioned a couple of journals which they consider as non-predatory journals. So if you want to be considered for career progress, you should have published in one of the journals listed there. And many predatory journals have also entered that particular list. So if they communicate to you APCs directly, there is a very high probability that someone might show this particular document to the managers of that particular list, and then you might get tagged as a predatory publisher. But if you are doing it in a private communication, say for example over the phone or whatever it might be, the chances of that is much lesser. So I think that's also a reason why many of those publishers are playing safe there, and this is something which the government certainly need to address.
Yeah, that's.
Yes, I think so.
I was going to say that's what happens to me when I'm in India trying to buy a scarf or something.
Exactly, it's the same kind of bargaining which happens for your publications also.
So we have another a question from Dominique in Argentina. She says, "Thank you, Professor. Very interesting presentation. Congratulations for recommending Green OA and your dissension note with your colleague Madhan Mutu on APCs, a great concern in our developing regions. My question from Latin America is if India has a list of quality OA journals or recommends DOAJ journals to publish with no APCs." And then she has another question saying, and how will the policy deal with rewarding publishing in quality journals more than in prestige journals?
So thanks, Dominic, for those very interesting and important questions. On the first one, as far as I understand, the so-called CARE list, which is a primary list which an institution should consider in India today for career progress, doesn't take into consideration whether a journal has been included in the DOAJ list or not. So in an ideal scenario, the government could have said that, okay, if a particular journal is in this DOAJ list, yes, they should also be okay for consideration for career progress, but that hasn't been done. Having said that, I could also imagine maybe in the coming years, they might take a more, I would say, open approach there and allow DOJ list also to be included. But as it stands today, to the best of my knowledge, DOJ list is not part of that particular process. And then on the second aspect, yes, so within the group, yes, both Madan and I were strongly arguing that it's time to move away from looking at the prestige journals. What we should only look at is what we publish. And if I also look at the position which the principal scientific advisor to the Prime Minister, that is Professor Vijay Raghavan, is taking on many of the forums. He generally advocates for the importance of what is published rather than where is published. So since he is the one who is heading this particular science, technology, and innovation policy drafting initiative, my strong hope is that the final policy document will also make a very strong statement in this particular regard. But as I mentioned earlier, there is a strong group of researchers within the community which also says that no, we should also take into consideration the current practical realities, which is tied to reputed journals or the prestigious journals. So I do not know which group will eventually win. I truly hope that finally we will go for the emphasis on what is being published rather than where it is being published. And I'm just being optimistic here, but we still have to wait for a couple of more days to see what the final policy position will be.
Thank you, Arul. We have somebody has her hand up. Mojka Kotar has hand up. Would you like to?
Yes, please. Thank you very much. Thank you, Professor Scaria. It's really so interesting to listen to different aspects of the same thing. Everybody is talking about open access. Also congratulations for your Open Science India report. Amazing. I participate in negotiations with publishers like Elsevier, Wiley, and Springer, and they're really tough. Whatever we think that these are like negotiations, at the end it is what they have had in mind from the beginning. And I read the news at the end of September that Indian government is planning for one nation, one subscription. And I think that here there are no set prices yet. And a huge amount of money can be spent here. So how can this influence the plans for open access policy? And also, if there is money available for these subscriptions, wouldn't it be better to negotiate for publish and read?
Thanks, Monica, for that excellent question. So during the consultation process, so the idea of one nation, one subscription, one APC policy was brought to our attention also. And so we also had extensive deliberations on that. So in principle, yes, if this works, it's a good idea. But in practice, as you rightly pointed out, it's not gonna happen. The reason being, publishers have very, very clear ideas on what they want to achieve. If you really want to have a policy like one nation, one subscription, one APC policy, the publishers will have to share their actual cost of publication. And in today's world, if you look at the oligopolistic publishers whom we are talking about, none of them are actually going to share that data. And any policy, any subscription or APC rate which we are going to frame based on half-truths are going to be more harmful than what we are currently facing. So that's one extremely, extremely important thing. So from my also limited experiences with publishers suggest that even though the government wants something like that to happen, I don't think that's going to happen in a country like India because publishers won't give away the true figures. That's the main challenge which we are going to face.
I agree, and thank you very much, and good luck with whatever you're doing. It's great.
Thank you so much for that.
Okay, and are there any other questions or comments? Irina has her hand up. Irina?
It's related a bit to what Mojca was saying, because Mojca was instrumental in introducing an open science policy in Slovenia, and it's a policy that was adopted by a government. And I was wondering what role could governments play in this policy making process? Should they be the one setting up this umbrella frameworks that would include all the elements of equitable open science policies, or is it too optimistic to expect them to be involved in that?
So Irina, I would first like to hear from Mojca what was her experience from her country in this particular regard, and then maybe I should respond in this particular regard, right? I think that might be better.
So, excuse me, you're interested in the experience in forming the policy or adoption of policy?
At government's involvement.
Okay, involvement, okay. In a way, it was quite easy. Adopting the policy was easier than preparing and implementing the action plan. In Slovenia, things don't really happen quickly, especially not modern new things. And we took advantage of the fact that we were part of the European Union, and we somehow told important people that it is obligatory that we have to have the open access policy. And since they do not read original documents, this was basically Commission recommendation on access to and preservation of scientific information from 2012. But we told in the country like this is obligatory. So this was the reason that we did start late, but finally there was a working group nominated by the minister. It took 2 years to write the document because there was a lot of opposition within the working group, which should actually be in favor of open access, but not everybody was in favor. So the government adopted this document in September 2015, and then it took us 2 more years to prepare the action plan. And it was important that this open access policy was fully aligned with the European Union policy, actually the Commission policy. So if researchers participate in European projects or in national projects, they have the same provisions. So alignment in a certain area, it's really very needed. So implementation was the weakest part. Once it came to the government, it was easy. Before that, there is this interministerial consultation. Of course, the Ministry of Finance asked, how much will this cost? So this policy is agnostic regarding the type of open access. It allows green or gold. But we do not have any special funds. We never had funds for open access publishing. So if a researcher has enough money in the project, then it is eligible to spend this. But this policy ends now with 2020.
Okay, so if I may ask, why is the policy ending with 2020? Was that the original plan also, or?
The policy was from 2015 till 2020 because it is attached to the European research funding programs. Horizon 2020 ends now in December, and now we have a new working group to prepare draft open science policy for the next period, which will be the same period as Horizon Europe.
Okay. So, yeah, thanks so much for those insights. Yeah, I think there's a lot to learn from your experience in this particular regard. So, regarding my response, so as I tried to indicate, I think at the beginning part of my presentation, so one of the challenges which I see in the Indian context is that most of the researchers are still not accepting the fact that there is a crisis in science in India, both in terms of how science is produced or in terms of how science is communicated. And if the research community is not recognizing it, I think the government has a role to play in at least, yes, taking some initiatives to make people also understand that, okay, there is something wrong in this particular area, maybe we need to do something there. So to that extent, I think government initiatives or the initiatives which are taken by different ministries are very, very helpful. But our experience with the way the 2014 Department of Science and Technology and Department of Biotechnology Open Access Policy implementation happened also show that the government has severe limitations in implementing an open access mandate. Because as I mentioned or indicated briefly during my presentation, we had conducted a study on how that particular mandate was accepted or implemented by researchers, and we tried to use the right to information application. So we filed more than 200 RTA applications to researchers who had taken funding from one of those funding agencies, Department of Science and Technology, and tried to see through those RTA applications whether the government had communicated to them that, okay, there is a mandate like this which we need to fulfill. And also, we also tried to check whether these researchers who had taken money from this particular funding agency which had a mandate, whether they complied with that policy which was in existence from the year 2014. The RTA replies which we received from more than 138 researchers who had taken funding suggest that the vast majority of them confirmed that there was no specific communication from the government regarding the existence of the policy. And it also confirmed that most of them haven't confirmed with the mandate. Of course, if there was no communication and if they also know that no action will be taken against them by the government, there is hardly any incentive for complaint, right? So on that front, yes, the government has also failed miserably in the past. But with the emerging policy, I am also strongly hoping that there will be certain inbuilt mechanisms which will ensure that, yes, the government won't be directly monitoring, but at least there will be some institutional level measures to ensure that people will comply with whatever open access mandate that is coming out of this particular policy document. So that's a very, very important role. And I again re-emphasize, I wouldn't be in favor of complete government intervention or complete government monitoring there, but at least there should be some initial steps that should be coming. And then, yes, I think the institutions and the research community should take responsibility for monitoring this. And I think as Kathleen was, I think, indicating earlier, if our own colleagues are more careful and more watchful about the complaints with these kinds of open access mandates, I'm sure that the complaints rates will go up over the years, and then we won't even require any government intervention in this particular area. But for that, yes, the complete research assessment system has to be overseen.
Yeah, I think we find, certainly here in Canada, we have had an open access policy for several years, but because the funders are not monitoring compliance, it has not been complied with at very high rate. So it's definitely important to start tracking that kind of thing. But on that note, I think we've passed the hour, and there are no more questions. So I think maybe we should wrap up. And I'd like to say thank you so much again, Arul, for your really great presentation, your insightful comments about the process you're going through in India, and we really look forward to the policy being publicly available, which I guess will have to happen by the end of December.
Exactly, that's what most of the key persons are conveying. So, but we still do not know. But yes, let's be hopeful on that front also.
Okay, yeah, and if you could, send us a note when the policy is available, that would be great. I would really happy to. Absolutely. And
thanks again to both Irina and Kathleen for organizing this, and I really enjoyed the discussion. So thanks to all the participants for the wonderful questions you asked, and let's stay in touch.
Okay, thanks again, everyone, and good evening, good afternoon, or good morning, depending on where you are.